Number 2. The Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople. After the failure of the Third Crusade to recapture Jerusalem, the Crusaders devised a new strategy. Instead, they would strike at the wealthy Muslim province of Egypt, which was the power base of the Ayyubid dynasty, which controlled Jerusalem at that time. By taking Egypt, the Crusaders would effectively cut the head off the serpent. However, taking Egypt would require the Crusader army to sail south across the Mediterranean, and for this they needed a fleet. And where to get a fleet? Venice. The city of Venice was a merchant city and was therefore very, very rich and had a very, very large navy. The Crusaders agreed to pay the Venetians a large sum of money if the Venetians would build them a massive fleet. However, when the Crusaders mustered their forces and arrived in Venice in 1202, they realised that they had way too many ships, only 13,000 troops, and couldn't get anywhere near paying their debt to Venice. So the Venetians offered the Crusaders a deal. If the Crusader army would sack the city of Zara, one of Venice's rivals in the region, the Venetians promised to reduce the debt the Crusaders were in and also contribute its own troops and navy to the crusade. The Crusaders were basically being asked to lead a crusade against other Christians. And they agreed. When the Pope, Innocent III, was told about the deal, he was furious and sent a letter that threatened the entire army with excommunication if they went through with it. However, the leader of the crusade, Boniface of Montferrat, had this letter hidden from his troops in order to keep the crusade afloat. The citizens of Zara watched in shock as a Christian army destroyed their city. The Pope, while he was very angry, decided not to excommunicate the army when he realised that they had not been shown his letter, and just excommunicated the Venetians instead. It was after the sack of Zara that Boniface of Montferrat was approached by Prince Alexius of the Byzantine Empire. His father, Isaac II, had been blinded and dethroned by Alexius's uncle, who was also called Alexius III, so sort of like the Lion King. Prince Alexius promised the Crusaders an impossibly large amount of money if he and his family were restored to the throne. An impossibly large amount of money because it was impossible that Alexius would be able to pay it. He also promised that he would convert to Western Catholicism rather than Eastern Orthodoxy once he ascended to the throne. And so, hoping to completely pay off their debt to Venice, the Crusaders agreed, and this next bit is just pure pain for any Byzantine history fan. The Crusaders arrived outside Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, in 1203, and fought a few brief skirmishes in which the Byzantines came out on top, thanks to the elite Varangian Guard, which was a 10,000-strong regiment of fierce Viking mercenaries that garrisoned the city. Feeling more confident, the emperor sallied out of the city with his own troops, but then suddenly felt less confident and ran back inside the city. This was seen as an act of cowardice by the people of Constantinople, and so Alexius III fled the city, and the Crusaders were able to reinstate Prince Alexios as Alexios IV, and his father Isaac II as co-emperors. However, as I mentioned before, Alexius couldn't actually pay the Crusaders what he had promised, and as the emperor scrambled to collect money, tensions grew inside the city, as the Greek populace grew angry, resentful, and anxious. Suddenly, a riot broke out, and the Italian population of the city was massacred by the Greek rioters. The Venetian troops retaliated, breaking into the city on multiple occasions, and although both times they were beaten back, they managed to set on fire part of the city. Then, in January 1204, Alexius IV was deposed and strangled by a member of a rival family called Mortsophilus, who, just to make things a bit more complicated, changed his name to Alexius upon taking the throne. The newly proclaimed Alexios V refused to pay the Crusaders anything. He, and much of the Greek population, saw them as a rabble of unwanted barbarians that had turned up outside his walls, and who he would not be paying anything to. However, just as the Crusaders prepared to storm the walls, the Varangian Guard demanded a pay rise in return for their loyalty to this usurper. The emperor simply didn't have enough money to do this, and so, at the empire's greatest time of need, the Varangians abandoned it. And when the Crusaders assaulted the walls, Constantinople was defenceless. They broke through and began a brutal sack, burning, pillaging and killing through the streets of the great city. Bathhouses and cathedrals built in the glory days of the Roman Empire that had stood untouched for 9 centuries were burnt down. Great palaces and mansions belonging to the aristocracy and the emperor were looted and destroyed. Priceless relics, icons and works of art were stolen and later pawned off by the Crusaders, never to be returned to the city. The Venetians took great delight in getting their revenge on the Greek population, and the proud, rowdy, fiery, outspoken populace of Constantinople was silenced. A population that had numbered 300,000 would shrink to a mere 10,000. Constantinople, the biggest, most populated, most wealthy city in all Christendom, New Rome, the second city of Christianity, was brought to ruin by fellow Christians. The Byzantine historian Nicetas Choniates, who witnessed the sack, writes, "No one was without a share in the grief. In alleys, in the streets, in the temples, complaints, weeping, lamentations, grief, the groaning of men, the shrieks of women. Nobles wandered ignominiously, those of venerable age in tears, the rich in poverty. Thus it was in the streets, on the corners, in the temple. All places, everywhere, were filled with all kinds of crime." The Eastern Orthodox Church officially only forgave the Catholic Church for the sacking in 2007. In the aftermath of the siege, the Crusaders took possession of the city, and the empire was split up between the Crusaders and a few Greek puppet kings, while the Byzantines fled to Asia Minor, establishing the Empire of Nicaea. Number 1. The Sack of Baghdad. In the mid-13th century, the city of Baghdad in modern-day Iraq was the most populated and largest city in the world, with its population numbering somewhere around the million mark. It was a hub of knowledge and learning, and the most important city in the Muslim world. At this time, it was ruled by the Abbasid Caliph, who, and this is very much an oversimplification of his role, was basically the religious head for all Sunni Muslims, and Abbasid was just the name of his dynasty. To the east of Baghdad and the Abbasid Caliphate was the absolutely massive Mongol Empire. The Mongols, led by the infamous Genghis Khan, had swept through the world, storming out of their homeland, the Mongolian steppe, and built a giant empire, brutally subjugating the people of China, Russia, Central Asia, and Iran. The price for resisting was to be completely and utterly destroyed, as many overconfident rulers learnt the hard way. The Abbasids had been paying the Mongols tribute since 1241, and in return the Mongols very generously did not terrorize the people of the Caliphate. However, in 1257, the Mongol commander of the Middle East, Hulagu, demanded that the Caliph travel all the way to Mongolia, to the Mongol capital of Karakorum, to personally submit to the great Khan of the Mongol Empire. If he refused to do so, Hulagu threatened to march on Baghdad and destroy it. The Caliph haughtily refused. Thanks to his own arrogance, combined with the influence of his advisors, who were always trying to undermine him, Al-Mustasim seems to have been under the impression that he was superior to the Mongols and far more powerful. Now all you need to do is look at the size of the Abbasid Caliphate and then look at the size of the Mongol Empire to realize just how wrong the Caliph was. The Caliph saw the Mongols as an uncivilized barbarian horde who could not possibly have the strength and perhaps even intelligence to threaten Baghdad. He also seems to have been under the illusion that his influence and power was so great that if he went to war with the Mongols, he would have the full backing of the Sunni Muslim world. The absurd idea that the constantly warring and squabbling sultans and emirs of Syria, Arabia, Anatolia, and North Africa would suddenly unite under his banner and commit themselves to a war which offered no personal gain, once again highlights the ignorance of the Caliph. And so, for all of these reasons, the Caliph refused. But not only did he refuse, which in itself was a terrible decision, but he also insulted Hulagu, the Mongol general, in his letter, and dared him to even try and touch Baghdad. And that right there sealed the fate of hundreds of thousands of people. This rash, idiotic letter would cost the Caliph his city, his people, and his life. Hulagu read the letter and, enraged, marched on Baghdad with the intention of wiping it off the face of the earth. There would be no mercy for anyone now, and there was now no turning back for the Caliph. His ship had already sailed, and even though he would desperately try to steer it back around, he would only find himself in deeper and deeper water as a result. In January 1257, the vanguard of a gigantic Mongol army, numbering around 150,000 troops, reached Baghdad. The city had only 50,000 defenders, as the Caliph, so confident of his own superiority, had not reinforced the city's garrison or bolstered his defences. Al-Mustasim ordered 20,000 of his cavalry to sally out of the city and meet the Mongol vanguard. It was a complete success, and they managed to break their enemy with minimal casualties. But instead of returning back inside the city, the victorious troops decided that it would make much more sense just to have a massive party. The next morning, after their party, they found themselves surrounded by the Mongols. They were butchered. Then, on the 29th of January, Hulagu completely surrounded Baghdad, cutting it off from supplies and any outside help. But don't worry, there's no way this uncivilized barbarian warlord has the siege weapons capable of breaching the mighty walls of Baghdad. Right? Wrong. At his disposal, Hulagu had some of the most advanced Chinese siege weapons and expert Chinese engineers. The walls of Baghdad were no match for such powerful weapons, and it didn't take long before the Caliph, realizing his grave situation, offered peace. But Hulagu had made up his mind, and it was too late for the Caliph. Peace was not an option. In this vain attempt to make peace, it seems that 300 nobles had ridden out of the city, unarmed, into the Mongol camp, hoping to negotiate, and that Baghdad would be spared the wrath of the Mongols. They were all murdered on the spot. Then Hulagu changed his tune. He sent a message to the Caliph saying that if he and his remaining 30,000 defenders came out of the city unarmed to submit to Hulagu, then they would be spared. Al-Mustasim must have been aware of the very obvious risk of this move, but with no other option, he agreed. But sadly, Hulagu had no such intentions. It was all a cruel ploy. The Mongols drew their weapons and cut the defenders to ribbons. Baghdad was already in a hopeless situation, but this was the nail in the coffin for the city. On the 9th of February, the city surrendered, and the Mongols unleashed 7 days of bloodletting and depredation on the city. One source writes that the river Tigris that runs through Baghdad ran red with the blood of innocent civilians. Much of the city was put to the torch, and ornate mosques and palaces that had stood for hundreds of years, filled with so much beauty and riches, were burnt to the ground without a thought. As with the other sackings, killing was indiscriminate, and small children suffered the same fate as their families. The great house of wisdom, filled with priceless books on all sorts of different topics, some of which were more than 600 years old, were destroyed, and its books were carelessly tossed into the Tigris. Another source states that the Tigris ran bluish-black with ink, and says that the river was so clogged up with books and bodies that you could walk across it. The only people that were spared were the Christian population, who were told by Hulagu to lock themselves in a church till the killing was over. He did this as a large part of his army was Christian, and so was his son and one of his wives. And what happened to al-Mustasim? Well, one source states that he was locked in a room filled with riches and left to starve to death, while another source states that he was rolled up in a fine carpet and trampled to death by one of his horses. Sources range a lot, but most historians put the death toll at around 800,000, about 80% of Baghdad's entire population at the time.